Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 63 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm back here with Curt and Jerry today. And on episode 63, we're going to build off the episode 62, where we introduced the concept of heart rate variability, parasympathetic, sympathetic nervous system. So highly suggest if you haven't listened to episode 62, it's a shorter episode that we created as an introductory to this series that we're doing. So if you haven't taken a look at that, please go back and listen to that. We're going to build upon that with some articles today as well, which you can always find in the show notes at traumainformedlens.org. So today I titled this episode, The Autonomic Nervous System and Trauma. So we're going to look at a few really cool articles. And yes, Jerry, I learned how to say autonomic, but I had to practice it a few times. So
you just made up a word, Matt.
I know. As you can tell, pronunciation, not my best skill set. And I can't really say enunciation whatsoever either. So yeah, it's autonomic. It's not, I think I'm there.
Autonomic.
Yeah, thanks. Close enough. So we're going to have some fun with this topic. Look at some really cool articles that came out that I think really can inform our thinking and our work as well. As always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week this week. And I'm going to start because I've been thinking about one ever since I ended the episode. And it was the show Homecoming off Amazon Prime. And I saw we were looking for a show, my wife and I, over Thanksgiving break to start, and Julia Roberts did a TV show, which was enough to get us to peek in and see what it was about. And it turns out to be a topic that we actually covered on a past episode where we did a thought experiment about what if we could eliminate traumatic memories? Not that we have the technology to do that right now, but it seems like potentially with the more we understand about the brain, that's something that might happen in the near future. Again, we were thinking a few decades off, and this show done by the guy who does Mr. Robot, which I think is one of the best shows out there, one of my favorites for all you nerds out there that if you haven't watched Mr. Robot, you gotta watch Mr. Robot. And it talks about how this defense contractor was working with vets to eliminate their traumatic memories of war to get them back onto the battlefield, which is kind of got some historical pieces of where the trauma movement has had starts and stops throughout history. And just a really fascinating, it talks about the ethical implementations of all this and a lot of things. So if you're looking for a good episode, it's not too much like I like to escape when I watch TV sometimes. Not really it's going to remind you of your work kind of thing, but kind of a fun thing. If you like the podcast and our nerdiness, you'd probably like that show as well. So my bright, shiny object of the week this week is Homecoming. So Jerry, what about you? What do you think about this week?
So, I started to watch Homecoming, and it's really a nice example of uninformed consent.
Yes.
So
yes, it absolutely is.
Right. So, but what I want to talk about this week is I've been finishing up the third episode of a trilogy by Brandon Sanderson, which is a science fiction novel. And I don't really want to talk about Brandon Sanderson other than the benefit of periodically leaving your work and reading something or engaging in something, and in some ways finding some way to rejuvenate yourself, to find some place to escape. And I think there's this process of dissociation that we talked about here on the episodes a lot, and there's healthy dissociation and unhealthy dissociation. And so engaging in reading stories about things that really take place in the future or take place way in the past allows us to get some distance from our daily life and in some ways engage in some rejuvenation. So I want to encourage people in their work as part of their health regime to kind of find some place to kind of leave your work and get into something that's a little bit different and rejuvenating.
Very cool. Curt, we're kind of coming from the sci-fi area. What's your bright, shiny object of the week this week?
I'm really glad to have a job that allows me to be sitting here on a Thursday afternoon, with my hat on backwards, being really comfortable and recording a podcast, and switching back and forth between work tasks and petting my dogs, and being able to meet with the two of you on a nice afternoon like this is just really enjoyable, and I feel really fortunate to have that kind of a situation that I can be in. So I'm just really grateful for that, and appreciating that today.
Very cool. Very cool. So Curt, I'm gonna hand it over to you, my friend. You gave us two really cool articles to read that I want you maybe just to sort of maybe do an overview of some of the themes in case a listener hasn't had a chance to go read those yet, but just some of the big themes coming out of that, and I know we're going to cover some articles from a specific journal as well. So maybe set this up for us and give us some of the themes coming out of those articles.
I also had a kind of a secondary bright, shiny object after our episode was released. I got multiple text messages from former colleagues and friends who had listened to it and are continuing some of the work that we started in using heart rate to help treat children both with intellectual disabilities, with traumatic exposure. And so that it was just I got a lot of feedback and a lot of actual questions, which is nice.
Cool.
We have some questions. So I'll try and kind of hit on a few of those too. And also these two articles that I tossed out today, I've recently just reread them. I kind of finished before we started talking today, and my first reaction to it was, wow, they're dense. There's a lot in there. There's a lot of data, a lot of statistics in there, and a lot of results to kind of go through, and it could be pretty overwhelming. So I just kind of thinking about these two articles and really why I picked these two articles and some of the points that came out of them that were pretty important for me. So the first one I want to talk about is the article that talks about heart rate variability as a biomarker for autonomic differences between children with chronic pain and those without. Sorry, my dogs are playing. Let me correct them really quickly.
Do some behavioral intervention.
You shock?
Ring the bell. Ring the bell.
All right.
Welcome back, Curt.
Sorry about that. They were just getting loud. So this article about comparing children with chronic pain to children with healthy controlled children on a pain-related task, right? So this experiment was taking these two groups of children, one who experienced pain every day, almost constantly every day, and then children who do not, and then they actually compared their response of their nervous system to tasks that were related to actually causing pain. Matt, here's where you can insert your comments about the cruelty of psychological research.
Yeah.
Sounds terrible, right? But
yeah.
I think the main publishing body was in Great Britain, so we can
okay.
England for this one.
The English.
Yeah, sure. Although I'm looking at the article and there's like UCLA on there and things like that. So maybe you can talk to them next time you go back to California.
I'm there next week, so I'll have a chat with them.
So I think this is really interesting in one sense, in that when we look at some of the literature about physical pain and response to physical pain, and the physiological and psychological responses to psychological or emotional pain, they're quite similar, and that our bodies react really similarly to both of those kinds of events. And so I looked at this one and said, This is a great way of us understanding that there are differences in our physiological response patterns when we have different life experiences. That's one of the main points of this first article. And as you read through these, I love reading through these articles because oftentimes in the introduction section, you get these great kind of snippets and, 2-paragraph kind of explanations of really complex phenomena like heart rate variability or parasympathetic sympathetic balance and vagal tone. And you get some nice words to use around what these processes and what these phenomena actually are. So that's some of the utility of these articles. So this article is pretty interesting in its results, and it showed pretty clearly that among these two groups of children, one, they didn't necessarily show that children who had chronic pain had a different response to pain-related events from healthy controlled children. But the response was kind of like, it wasn't what you would kind of expect. It was an attenuated response. So their nervous system was actually less responsive to pain-related tasks than it was to the healthy controlled children. So as we think about some of this fight or flight, right, and we think about hyperarousal a lot and being triggered a lot, that's only one pathway that exposure to adverse childhood experiences can change how we react to environmental events. Another way is it can produce some dissociation from those events or an under-responsiveness to those events. So it gave us some physiological mechanisms to kind of understand that and see those results when we compared the physiology of these two groups. So I like this one. This is a great one for some of those explanations and a great example of showing differences in how we respond to pain, which is a nice corollary from physical pain to emotional and psychological pain as well. That's kind of overview of the first one. I want to throw it to you guys and see if there are any kind of things that I missed that you're thinking as you thought about this article or read this article, or any questions that came up for you that you think our listeners would want to kind of know about from this one, and before I go on to that second one. So let me kick it to you first, Matt, if there's anything you're thinking based on.
I just think it's fascinating to see, and I don't think, reading this wasn't a surprise from everything we've talked about, but I think, it's just really powerful as, these came out a couple of years ago now, I believe, and it's just like understanding, I think, it kicked me back to my training and thinking about psychology. And really, we talked about psychology as almost this thing that was interdependent. There was like this mental functioning that was different than biological functioning. That there was kind of, we were trying to put mind and body back together again. The biopsychosocial model kind of gave us ways to think about that. But I think what these really show to me, and what a whole bunch of, I think, where the research has gone in recent years, is really that the power of experiences in our environment, especially as intense as trauma, and how our biology really adapts in ways that are really powerful. Again, with repeated extreme trauma, you get these extreme reactions to both, social, psychological, cognitive responses. And to see some of this stuff come out on, the pain piece, chronic pain, lupus, cancer, and all these other biological responses, again, it's really challenged, what I got trained on a decade and a half or so ago, as biology and psychology, mind and body, so intertwined now that it's impossible, I think, to talk about one outside the context of the other. And that's where I think this work is a reminder of the power of that.
Yeah. And I think notably too, as you talk about the different areas where we've tried to separate all these different areas, and we've kind of talked about this in some of our conversations, that we study things in isolation. Mm-hmm. We study them as if they are isolated systems, not interacting with other systems. And we do that because we need to characterize them and understand them in order to understand the whole. But it's easy to start thinking that it's compartmentalized. And so I think a kind of a corollary to that, or an example of how important it is to put these things back together, is looking at things from multiple perspectives and then trying to integrate them. So one of the reasons why I like this article as well, and like to use this article, is that it's not published in any kind of psychology journal. This comes from the Journal of Pain Research. So as we think about gathering perspectives and understanding different perspectives, I think that's a nice way for us to start thinking about how can we get information from other people, other disciplines' perspectives and other people's perspectives to integrate into kind of a holistic view of what's happening.
Yeah.
Jerry, kick it to you. What kind of thoughts are kicking around in your head?
You know, I was thinking as I read through it, as I've thought through this, is that this is a measure of general efficiency and stability of the nervous system, right? Kind of looking at that. Where's that coming from?
That's Matt.
Yeah, that's my phone. Sorry.
I was thinking my nervous system is really screwed up.
Yeah.
So you know, we can think about it as a general measure of flexibility and adaptability that individuals have, right? And that experiences that we have both externally and internally, whether it be a demand in the environment or internal distress, our nervous system has to be able to respond to those, but it also has to be able to return back to some level of baseline. Mm-hmm. That's our definition of resiliency, right? And so this heart rate variability allows us in some ways to measure the efficiency and effectiveness of our nervous system's ability to manage state changes. So I think it's, in a way, it goes back to the model thinking about, there was a time before we had thermometers to know what our temperature was. So we put our hand on our heads and we did it and we got an estimate, but now we can actually have something to go in and give us a number to say, yes, you know, you're hot, but you're really hot, right? So I think this measure really isn't something we didn't know subjectively, but it allows us to have a measure to go in and look at that. And then there are some individuals who are going to be born and who have higher heart rate variability that are biologically more robust and able to manage. And there are some individuals who are born who are going to be more vulnerable. And so as we begin to measure these, we can begin to think about the kind of interventions that individuals need in order to scaffold them and support them in their well-being.
Right.
So I really thought there was some really good takeaways from this as a way of adding to our capacity to get information, mm-hmm. to identify what types of interventions, and also to measure the effectiveness of interventions. Mm-hmm. Right. Because in the past, what we used to do is measure cortisol levels as an indication of subjective stress. But what we now know is that experiences either increase cortisol levels or can decrease baseline cortisol levels. So you can't assume just because somebody has a low cortisol level that they're not stressed.
Right, right.
This is a different measure that allows us to answer that same kind of question.
Right. Well, we actually saw that result in the second article.
Exactly.
There is actually, there's some nuance to.
Exactly. So I think it really gives us another tool to begin to both assess what types of interventions to use, but also the effectiveness of the interventions we're using.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Well, Kurt, I want to throw something your way too. As you look at this, because it's now where like I don't know. I always like go to history on some of this stuff because I thought I think it was the Greeks who thought basically cognitive and mental functioning was in the heart. and they thought, I believe, that the brain was just kind of a air conditioner for the rest of the body. I just find it fascinating. And then you look at all the gut research as well, and we kind of talk about in the skin in almost a generic way, because if not, then we have to like start to define all these things, and then we start to define all these: the brain, the heart, the gut, the nervous system. And then I think one of the things that I find fascinating with this is to look at one of those in isolation is really almost a false examination. Just kind of like to say, oh, the prefrontal cortex is in charge of executive functioning. Well, that's an easy way, as Jerry says, every model is kind of, yeah, it is. And yet it's so much more complex than that. So, I wonder, coming out of, a background, and I know this is going to way oversimplify the complexity of behavioralism, but, focusing a lot of times on stimulus A leads to response B. And somewhat, and I know it's a lot more complex than that, so I mean, no disrespect to that, but, just like Pavlov's dog, you ring a bell and there's salivation, that sort of, very simplified thing. And I kind of wonder, from your perspective, now that we have all this information coming out about gut health and, the connection between the gut and the brain and the heart and the brain and the heart and the gut, and just kind of how's this inform your thinking of looking at different ways of constructing interventions?
So I'll kind of start with to this day, as long as I've been doing behavioral interventions and thinking about this kind of thing, I still get fascinated by the information that we've learned over the last 100 years about how responsive organisms, including humans and other animals, how responsive we can be to environmental events, and how understanding how the environment can impact behavior, and then behavior can in turn impact the environment, and that loop, like without taking any of the physiology that we've learned and like all of that stuff, just that basic kind of relational, interactional, transactional relationship. I still get fascinated by that. I still get jazzed by that. I still get excited about that, about understanding those things like stimulus control and things like phenomena like stimulus equivalence, how you can train a response to one kind of event and another one can become the exact same thing. Like how actually adaptive our bodies and our brains and our behavior is. I, to this day, get fascinated by that and excited by it. When I start to think about also, and I've thought this for many years since I read some of B.F. Skinner's first work, and in the late 1980s, he was asked a lot of questions about cognitive psychology, because that was starting to become the big rise in the cognitive movement, right? In the 80s, we got computers and we got new metaphors and we got new ways of thinking about things. And so it started to change how people talked and wanted to understand the world. And, Skinner was a smart guy. I mean, he was a scary, smart guy. And one of the things that he said was, he was still kind of saying, we're not there yet. These new metaphors are fine, but they're still metaphors. Like we're not quite to the point where we understand these things yet. And he was still, I think too, fascinated by this interaction between environment and behavior. And he said, one day the physiologist of the future will be able to tell us what's going on inside of the skin. But that day is not today. This was 60, 70 years ago, right? And there was a ton of, physiological research then that was really coming into en vogue and was really exciting. And I took that even when I was in grad school reading that, and I was interested in physiology and neurobiology and thought, I had to start looking into that because I'm now 60 years later and I'm now in the day that he was talking about then.
Yeah.
I ought to be interested in that. And so I really started getting into this and finding that, I think there's a phrase in one of these articles that says, and this is why I think the stress response is so incredibly important, is that its major function is to create responses to external events, which is what I'm interested in, right? That's the thing that I get jazzed about. And this is the system that is really, really critical in developing those things. And the changes in this system change how we respond to environmental events. And that's really fascinating to me. and a great kind of, I love some of the detail of this article, and some of these words can get really kind of overwhelming when you read them and you haven't read them before, right? Things like high frequency normalized power, right? And you know, HF to LF frequency band power. Like, if people reading that, we've got to be like, what the hell is that? Like, and how is that important? Right? But here's, I think if the early behaviorists who were so also interested in physiology could read this and understand that this measure, like, it doesn't really matter what high frequency normalized power is. You don't really have to understand what that is and how to calculate it to know that it's a measure of vagal tone. It's a measure of parasympathetic function within the autonomic nervous system. Well, that's pretty cool, because we're talking about that balance all the time, and now here we've got a measure that can tell us. And then you have this other high frequency, low frequency ratio, which is a measure of sympathetic balance. So we have numbers that we can actually look at how this balance is functioning on a moment to moment basis, and interpret then how any of these children in this study, say, are showing differential responsiveness, either on a physiological level or on a behavioral level, to pain-related stimuli or any other kind of events, and start to understand even better with different levels of analysis why that's happening. And that's exciting and super jazzing for me. So that's a long answer to your short question.
A good answer, yeah. So I wonder kind of what, as you think about that and looking at this article with the pain stuff.
So I wanna kind of jump in.
Go for it, Jack.
Respond to a couple of things. One is, I think in the literature in the field today, they have begun to talk about the embodied brain. Is that really we're talking about not this thing that sits in our skull, but this neural network that is in our body, in our guts, around our heart, to kind of look at that, and beginning to understand this embodied brain, to kind of look at that. The other piece is that Curt kind of said that the part of the nervous system's body is to respond to the environment. Well, that also includes the internal environment. And that really what the primary role of the stress response system is to regulate states, is to be able to change our internal states when there's external demands or internal demands, and regulate those states, right? And so this concept of state regulation becomes really important. And the behaviors that we see are the individual or organism, however you want to describe it, it's their attempt to regulate their states, right? Is that if I move away from this thing that's threatening me, I will return back to a calm state. If I eat something, my state will change back to, so that our internal environment is constantly monitoring multiple systems and multiple states. And our stress response system is really a reaction to this interoceptive process that's happening at all times. Some of it's conscious, some of it's unconscious, right? It's just happening. And so we have this incredible ability to reallocate resources based on state changes, right? And our behaviors we see have a lot to do with this internal process that we're looking at. So if we just look at the behavior looks in some ways maladaptive to this environment, but in some ways that individual on a physiological level, that behavior is serving some internal function, right? And so when we do functional analysis, we can't just look at the environment of what's going on, but we also have to look at, on this physiological level, what is the function of that behavior in terms of managing these internal states, right? And I think that that's a lot of what Curt defines as in the skin, right? Is that these behaviors somehow are causing me to feel in some ways more better and more balanced internally, even though they're creating these disturbances in the external world. They're kind of looking at that piece. So having this measure kind of allows us to move away from a judgment about the behavior and assessing what the function is, and then maybe helping that person find that function in a different way. But we can, in some ways, look at how adaptive some of what we were seeing as maladaptive kind of were. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important part of this measurement component.
Yeah. Two, my hope is that we can share with more people some of the things that I think the three of us have found, coming from different philosophical backgrounds and training backgrounds, that we've found ways to have some common language and some common mental models about what we're talking about, so that we can share all these different perspectives to come to a more complete understanding. And I think that's something that's really kind of sorely missing in our collective fields, is we tend to get in camps with our philosophical, theoretical training backgrounds and not be able to have conversations and discussions because we use different words to describe very similar things, right? And so I think that that's really important. Some of this language of physiology can really help to bridge some of those gaps between people trained in a more behavioral, theoretical, philosophical background and others trained in a more psychological background. I think those two really need to talk to one another.
Right. That's right. And it also kind of changes our thinking about, is this physical or is this psychological? The answer to that is yes.
Yeah. Right. Depends on your unit of analysis, basically.
That's right. That's
well, and I think, the whole Daniel Siegel definition of the mind, as you know, not, the environment, relationships, the flow of energy and information, and really taking it out of the brain individually or the environment, but a collectiveness of all of that. And I think how those systems interact is not just from a behavioralist, psychological, mental or however we want to divide it, but you just think about how important the health of the individual is into all of this, and how diverse our interventions can be with nutrition, with exercise, especially when we talk about heart rate. So much of that for me comes from my understanding as an athlete, and especially somebody who dabbles into distance running from time to time, and trying to keep my heart rate at a lower and my breathing lower so I can run further, not necessarily faster. I'm not sprinting, but that I can get those miles in. So I think taking some of these things that even I learned about as an athlete per se, and now thinking about how that impacts our psychology as well. And I just think that it's fascinating how many doors and opportunities this opens up. I think it also increases the complexity, because if you just think about, we just got to change, this consequence reward structure in our classroom, that's something kind of tangible that you can see. But when you start to really think about, what's when this kid leaves the classroom and goes home, and how's that walking into the classroom? How's what the kid's eating at breakfast or not eating, so now we have all these different things. And I think that it's a beautiful complexity, but it shows that human beings, it's hard to say, hey, A equals B. That gets a lot harder, because to even explain A equals B takes a lot of really complexity. And so I think that's fascinating, and opens up a lot of windows and a lot of partnerships, but I think it expands the realm of, if you put healing or growth or wellness, we all have to get to the table in some way and really think about this from all those different perspectives, which I find fascinating, and at times can be a little overwhelming as somebody who tries to keep somewhat on top of all this science coming out now too.
One of the questions that one of my friends asked me was, she always wants to know about what to do about things, right? She's a big problem solver. So she's like, listen, Curt, you can tell me how to explain how to understand all this stuff all day long, but what I really want to know is, what do I do about it? It's a great question. And so one of the things that I took from this article that kind of leads with what to do is to think about our kind of tendency as humans to infer intent when we see behavior in others. Right? So when you look at the way that the response pattern of these children with chronic pain, who had an attenuated response to pain-related events, right? When we see people in an environment, this happens so much, I think, in our treatment environments, that when people don't get organized by environmental events the way that we expect, then we start to infer intentions to those things. And in this sense, you can look at the way that these children who had experienced chronic pain didn't get organized by pain-related events in their physiology, and how that could translate into a behavioral response. Right? They may not be moving away from pain, or they may not be moving towards a rewarding activity. We infer intent to those things, and that intent often gets characterized as something that is wrong with that person, right? That they're unmotivated, or they're defiant, or they're, some kind of disorder. And so using this kind of physiological understanding to start to understand how somebody could not be organized by environmental events, how their nervous system could contribute to that change in a behavioral response, can help us, as Jerry said, you're alluding to this, to help us to stay engaged with that person and look for new options where we might be able to get them to get engaged, right? Maybe pain-related stimuli is something that these children have actually experienced a tolerance to. Right? That would make some sense with this kind of presentation. They have chronic pain, we give them pain-related stimuli, their system has already attenuated a response to pain-related events, so they don't get organized by it, they don't respond to it in the same way. Well, maybe we need to get them to get organized by something other than a pain-related event, right? Their nervous system could respond to something different. So as we think about designing environments that are enriched and have positive, repetitive, rewarding relational activities, that just helps us to think about more options. I tried this one and that didn't work. Maybe I need to try another one or another one, and keep going through things in a really kind of systematic, determined way to find something that people can and are able to get organized by. And that's something that I took from this article as a way to stay just engaged in the process of being a treatment provider or being a caregiver. That it helps me to have a cognitive framework that makes me not give up, essentially. So that was one of my reactions to this article as well.
Very cool. Do you want to touch on the other one as well too?
Yeah, we're a little short on time. Do you want to keep going into that one?
Or do you want to hold that one off till next week? Because that's...
Well, we could.
Why don't we hold it? Why don't we hold it off and maybe kind of talk a little bit about, so what is the ramification? We have people on it who are working with individuals who have experienced attachment disruptions, have experienced exposure to violence, have experienced homelessness, have experienced major losses or some. How would this information help those individuals work with their clients if there were some takeaways and we could summarize from today's?
Yeah, you bet. So let's kind of talk about from an attachment perspective, right? When I think of that, and I can really behavioralize a lot of things. So if I kind of behavioralize some of the concepts from attachment, that one way we think about that is that it changes how the presence or absence of other people function as reinforcers or punishers in an environment, right? So we tend to regulate our internal states by being around others and being away from others. And most of us can titrate that and regulate that pretty freely. If I want to choose to be around others, then I can. If I want to choose to be away from others, I can do that too. And when we have children who have this disordered attachment or a reactive attachment, there's a reaction when people are with you and there's a reaction when people are away from you. And part of that reaction is in their behavior, which can be very troublesome, very frustrating to people around them. But some of that reaction is also in their nervous system. Right? So when people get close to, interviewed a lot of kids with attachment disorders, and one of the kind of themes that they say is when people get close to me, their experience is that I get scared, and when they're gone, I miss them. And part of what they're describing there is that's their way of explaining what the experience of their bodily sensations is. And that's really driven by changes in their physiological states, which is associated with this parasympathetic sympathetic balance with heart rate variability. And we have ways of kind of measuring these things. So as we think about what it is for the kind of the meaning that we have when kids do things to drive us away, or when they do things to get us to come closer, having some cognitive structure about understanding what's happening inside of that person's body can help us to put less judgment on those symptoms and help us to stay engaged and more systematic about how we're actually engaging them intentionally.
Right.
Is there kind of the question kind of to both of you, though? I totally agree with what you're saying, Curt, for sure, about it gives us maybe some more compassion, patience in the work, but there seems to be a gap right now, and I just want to make sure you're seeing this like I'm seeing it, of it really kind of stinks to know we don't know what's going on inside of them at the same time. So I think that there's, while I totally agree that there's like compassion there, I think the whole what happened to you versus what's wrong with you shifted in thinking is maybe one of the most powerful ones we've come across in psychology in a long, long time. But yet I think for me, there's a little bit of a frustration there, and it's just where we are, I think, scientifically and economically in our fields, is I want to know what's going on in that person, because what I'm afraid of is if you think about how we've maybe structured school settings and kind of consequences there. I mean, I just think about my experience in residential care. I think about how we treat and structure interventions for people experiencing homelessness. Once we know about what's in the skin, a lot of this doesn't make sense, but yet we kind of have this collective data that can make us curious, but we're kind of not at the point yet to say, okay, this is what's going on inside the skin. Now I know how to best help this person. And I just kind of wonder, like, what's your thoughts on that? Because I want this information now. I want the person to know some of these markers, at least, to say, hey, this person, when I get close to them, because I tell people to build empathy, compassion, rapport, get synchronization. And for some people that might be triggering. So, how do we kind of use this information of there's sort of this curtain of we know that there's different stuff going on, but we don't know necessarily what's going on when we're trying to help somebody.
Right. So that's a really good point, right? Is that great that when we have the heart rate variability or we have the capacity to do all sorts of other measures, but really for the providers, most of them don't have access to that, right? But what we tend to do, Matt, just as you did, is we want to know what the story is. Mm-hmm. We're very cognitive. So I need to know, actually, tell me the details of what happened to you, and then I can help you, right? And so really what we're learning is in trauma work, actually going in and talking about the details of what happened isn't really helpful for people, right? It may be helpful for individuals who say they kept a secret for a very long time and now they could tell their secret. But the process more is, how do they begin to have more awareness and ability to regulate their internal states when managing these things, right? And so the question is not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. But the next question is, when that's happening to you, what does that feel like? Right? So when you're struggling in class and not able to get something, tell me a little bit about what's going on inside of you, as opposed to, let me just tell you what to do and not to do, right? When I'm meeting with you and you're telling me about how angry you are about not getting the housing that, or somebody listening to you, it's like, so when you're angry, where do you feel that in your body? right? Is that when we become way more aware that we can actually increase our ability to increase our heart rate variability by being more mindful, we can actually help people begin to do that. And that's really difficult for people who have trauma, right? Because what I've asked them to do is stop and look inside, right? And so in a way, what these measures do is they validate a lot of things that people have been doing really good in treatment, and they call into question other things we thought we were doing good, and they really aren't very good, right? So we could say is, oh, I'm going to go in here and talk about my abuse. Well, if I check my heart rate variability, I'm actually maybe worse than I was before I went to you, right? So again, is having this understanding is it pulls much more away from this just cognitive language of creating a narrative, which is an important component, but it's the end process of having yourself regulated, being able to create a connection, and then be able to create some kind of narrative. It isn't where we start the treatment to kind of look. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it also, go ahead, Curt.
I want to give you a couple of examples I'm thinking of how this information is used, and it has been used very concretely in a couple of interventions. So I was just talking to a group of classroom staff that I consult with, and some months ago, we were talking about a young girl in their class with part of our rituals in this class is to say, what are the diagnoses that the child has, like what are the kind of the symptoms that we see, and how do we characterize some of that, and what's their ACEs score? That's like number 2 question, so we have a sense of what has happened to this person. And so as we went through that, we were orienting a new group, some new staff to this classroom, and so we were kind of going through all the kids in the room, and one of the things that I wanted to do was to, instead of solely talking about all the challenges, how do you respond to what are all the risks, what are all the crisis response things, I wanted to have this new group of people understand what great work this classroom staff had done. And it reminded me of this intervention. I thought about it related to this article about attachment. Jerry, you were talking about that, and it kind of reminded me. One of the things that we used was a transitional object to manage the relational disengagement that was inevitable in a classroom setting, right? This young girl who we were talking about had experienced extreme neglect, a lot of abuse, and she really had some disrupted attachment. And so she couldn't really tolerate people being with her, and she could equally not tolerate them going away. And so one of the things that we did is we started talking about how at her developmental stage, kids often have an object that they carry around, which is often a permanent reminder of a caregiver, and it helps them to tolerate the disengagement that happens. And so even though she was a little older than what this developmental stage would be, we said, we think that she's got this mismatch between developmental and chronological age. And so we want to use this as an intervention. And interestingly, when we talked about it, the classroom staff at that time, this was some months ago, they said, oh, well, she loves to always bring a stuffed animal to school. We're always having to tell her to put it away. I'm like, she's carrying around a transitional object. How about let's use that? They were like, yeah, let's do it. And so we were like, well, how do we pick one? And this was a great opportunity to really kind of connect this staff with understanding this inside the skin kind of orientation to what was happening with this child. And so we started testing her. We did a little pulse oximeter, and we took her heart rate around multiple stuffed objects. And we found the one that actually calmed her down by measuring her heart rate. And that's the one we picked. And so what this staff would do when they were working with her one-on-one, and they were going to have to leave to go to another part of the room, is they would pick up this little stuffed animal and they would hand it to her and say, I have to go, but I want you to hold on to this until I come back. And it took about 3 weeks, and her reaction to relational disengagement was gone. And so it resulted in a very, very clear change in behavior driven by this kind of like way of looking at everything that was happening to her, both how her symptoms were interacting with her environment, how we could slightly shift those interactions that would capture a change in her behavior very, very quickly and really kind of pull her in this developmentally advanced direction of being able to tolerate a little bit of relational engagement, and an understanding of how this specific object had an impact very clearly by measuring her heart rate when she was around it, in calming her. And the staff could really then kind of visualize that when I give you this object, it calms you down. And I can understand that I can move away from you and you can tolerate it until I come back. So I just want to throw that out there as a way to kind of pull some of these together in how we can think about interacting with kids. And this is in a classroom, which I know you love to talk about, you know, trauma-informed schools. So, and that didn't require a change in how that classroom was designed. It didn't require a change in how the education was presented or curriculum changes. It really had to do with a change in how the staff behaved in relationship to this young girl. And one of the real great ways, I think, of using this data, this kind of using heart rate monitors and some of this physiological data, is that it captures a component of habit formation and behavior change that's missing in a lot of the ways we try and change staff behavior. In that, you know, the three critical components of habit formation are a cue, the behavior, and a reward. Like, those are three critical components. And one of the things that's missing when we think about changing the behavior of staff in relation to these kids is an appropriate cue. Like, when do I need to move closer? When do I need to move away? And using something like the internal state of the child and bringing that outside the skin so everybody can have access to it, you now have a cue that can occasion the right behavior. And if that then captures some change in that child's behavior, you now have a reward that starts to complete that whole three-part component of changing new habits and changing the behavior of staff. So it puts together some of those kind of behavioral components of how we change the habits of people interacting with those who've experienced trauma.
Right, and to kind of piggyback on that and follow up, is your clients are giving you cues all the time. We just have to become more sensitive reading cues. Is that just like when infants are born, there are some infants that are really good at cueing their caregivers and some that are hard to read, but they are giving cues, they're just harder to read. And so when you have a child like that, she was actually giving you a lot of cues, but you weren't recognizing. You were saying the rule says you can't have a stuffed animal in the right? You were rule bound, as you would say, as opposed to responding. So I think that for individuals who don't have these measurements, if you watch your client's body language, if you watch sometimes even the coloring in their face, or the dilation in their eyes, or the tone of their voice, you will see signals of change in states. And you can then begin to adjust your behavior based on those observations, to kind of look at that. But it really is helpful when you begin to not kind of focus just on the cognitions of what the person's or the language that they're using, the content, but begin to watch some of these physiological cues to guide you in your interactions.
Oh, the complexity. I love it. And I just think that it shows, I mean, and how, I think, and I don't want to open this big can of worms, but a lot of times I think too, the interventions that we try to do to address issues like, I just think about the most obvious one is putting someone who commits a crime, especially with a history of trauma, in a prison. What worse environment could we create to help someone change behavior with a history of trauma? I think some of the classroom interventions that we've done historically, suspending kids from school, it's just like, I wish we could almost just hit a reset and re-examine a lot of this stuff. I think it makes it a lot harder when we have these ingrained things that we're sort of working against. But I think at the same time, it's fascinating to think about how this will inform our work moving forward as well. I mean, I think it's equally parts exciting. And it's like when I start to really think about, okay, if a criminal justice system wants to really take this seriously and implement it, or even a school system under the current funding structures, how would we do that? And you know, it's just a lot of small steps in a lot of ways, like Jerry said, is to be curious and try to connect with where they're at. And I have a huge amount of empathy for, you know, my wife who stands in front of 23, 24 first graders and tries to manage all those states 1 on 24. And it's I think really shows why we've struggled, but the brilliance that's out there that we've had, you know, tremendous, you know, we've had helped a lot of people with this knowledge kind of coming just here recently as well. So, you know, it's a lot to hold, because it's like there's so much there that we could do so much with, and yet, you know, again, change is a systematic, slow process.
Right. So to end this, we have probably less chance of helping our clients, our students, our communities when we have low heart rate variability, right? So that I think the takeaway is, if we want to be more helpful, it isn't necessarily first to change our clients' heart rate variability, but how can we actually work on having increased ability to manage and regulate our own internal states. When we could do that, then we could be open and curious and creative and innovative in solutions that we find. But when we get dysregulated, we move to short-term decision-making focused on potential threats in the environment. It changes our behavior. So the takeaway of some of this information is not just for our clients, but is that it's for all of our nervous systems.
Great tie into the bright, shiny object, Jerry.
Yeah. And Curt, let me ask a final question coming off of Jerry. I know I just should end it there, but I gotta ask one more, because I think he brings up a great point. Because, you know, you don't go to a Matt Bennett training anymore without hearing the word mindfulness. It is there. So, Jerry, 100% agreement is the one internal environment that we do have well, it depends on who you ask, but we do have probably the most control over, at least, is our own, and how integral that is to our work as helpers. I guess I want to kind of throw out a last question here, though, is when we look at setting up therapeutic environments, be that a classroom, be that a residential treatment, whatever, a shelter, whatever we're talking about, you know, I want to say that thinking about environments that are very safe, that are, you know, have trusting relationships, everything we've always talked about, really what we're trying to do is create environments that promote a high rate of heart variability.
Higher heart rate variability.
Hey, I'm taking that as you tell me. Good job, Matt. Autonomic.
Greater parasympathetic influence really helps us to regulate our whole system.
Excellent. So I'm just going to say, yeah, Matt, you're right. So there you go. There's the takeaway. So this has been a fascinating.
I think strategy was to make a long enough statement that it's impossible to disagree with it.
There we go. Yes. And you just gave me a positive reward for it. So our listeners can blame you next time. So great discussion. Again, I in the show notes, I will both have this week's article, and since we only got to one this week, next week's article as well, if you want to read that ahead of time. All that, again, is at traumainformedlens.org. And you can find, I got some discussion questions up for there, find videos, links, resources, all that fun stuff. So Curt, Jerry, another great conversation. We'll see you all next week as we'll continue this exploration into our hearts.